Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope the wine, to some extent, compensated for the delay. I think you'll all understand why Willie Rennie felt he had to vote on this particular piece of legislation. So, Willie Rennie, MSP, leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, married with 2 sons, grew up in Strathmiglo, is that the correct?
That's right, that's the right way to say it.
Correct pronunciation. A member of Dunfermline's Carnegie Harriers. So obviously the Lib Dems are all athletes in one way or another. Delighted that he's with us to give the 4th of our 5 politicians and the professionals presentations. Given the delay, I will say no more. I will simply hand us over to Willie Rennie, and I think his speech, judging from what I've heard in advance and what I've seen, is going to be very interesting. Over to you, Willie.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Apologies again, it was the eco-marriage vote this evening. And since it was one of the issues that we've been kind of championing over the last couple of years, I felt it was impossible for me to avoid the vote. So apologies for being late, but hopefully you've enjoyed plenty of the wine in advance, perhaps not too much in advance. We'll soon test with the questions. In Britain, in Europe, in work. That's the title I've chosen for the presentation this evening. And I did that even though I know that the first 2 parts are not without controversy. I hope that the third part will at least be a point on which we can all agree. What I tend to show is that the UK's place in Europe and Scotland's place in the United Kingdom are essential to support Scottish jobs and the Scottish economy. That many of the arguments for one find a mirror in the other. That both the EU and UK require reform to be the best that they can be for Scotland. But now that each relationship has been placed fundamentally at stake, there is a need for the argument to be made for Scotland to be in Britain, in Europe, in work. I will show that as why my party is saying that the Liberal Democrats are the party of in. As I stand here at this lectern this evening, I do so against a more optimistic economic backdrop than many would have predicted. The labour market figures a fortnight ago show that across the UK there are more than 1.4 million extra people in employment compared to the figures at the start of the UK coalition government in 2010. 30 million people are in work. When you think of the sweep of history, that's quite a remarkable achievement. Against the decline of the traditional industries, the reduction of our global role, and the rise of the Pacific and the Far East, that wasn't something we were automatically entitled to expect. In Scotland, there are 130,000 more people with jobs since 2010. That is a record of job creation that compares strongly with the purported results of some of the more eye-catching measures promised in the White Paper. I will say a little more about that later. And Peter Jones, who's here this evening, wrote in the Times last month in relation to the GDP figures for Scotland. Our country has grown more strongly than even Norway and is hugely ahead of Denmark, Sweden and Finland. Even the Scottish Government has changed its argument from the recovery will not happen to it was us all along with no intervening period. At the heart of the argument I'm going to make is that the single market, making trade easier and allowing businesses based on innovation and excellence to thrive, is going to underpin our future success. 3 million jobs in Britain depend on Europe. We need to make Europe easy for business. Trade with Europe is worth £356 billion to the UK economy. As part of Europe, we are part of an economic market worth trillions. There are 500 million customers alone. It means that a Scottish company that is good and efficient at its job can expand across the continent. Easy access to 500 million customers is worth 3 million jobs in Britain. In Europe, in work. Similarly, as part of Britain, Scotland has trade across that border worth £85 billion. The recently published Scotland analysis paper from the UK government shows how that trade supports tens of thousands of jobs in Scotland. That report shows that there is a border effect which damages trade across any border, however allied the economies are and benevolent the relationships. It happens without a physical border. Perhaps most starkly, the border effect reduces trade between the United States and Canada by 44%. And that is even with the successes of the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement, which has seen trade more than triple, reaching $1 trillion. To me, it's instinctive. Economies that a small company looking to expand will choose first to develop within its jurisdiction. If you have just spent years building your business and getting to grips with red tape, the last thing you need is a whole new variety of red tape, even if it's written in the same language. I make the same case to avoid imposing borders that hit trade inside the present UK as any nationalist might for trade with the EU, in Britain, in work. The European community came out of a continent that had been devastated by conflicts between countries for 2 centuries. We don't know if there would have been conflict in Western Europe without the EEC. But we do know for certain that with the EEC and now the EU, there were not. The United Kingdom, strictly speaking, Great Britain, came about because of economic and financial collapse in Scotland. We don't know if Scotland would have endured that misery permanently, but we do know for certain that with the UK, Scotland did not. We now have employment rates as high as anywhere in Britain, an economy stronger than everywhere outside the southeast of England. And that isn't even to mention our contributions of the Enlightenment, David Hume himself, the foundation of economics and the fundamentals of the Industrial Revolution, all since the Act of Union. And one final similarity, perhaps. Each relationship has increasingly vocal critics, but each set of critics are undermined by a contradiction. The Eurosceptics say decisions are best if they are taken only by people who live here in the UK. They complain that they are losing influence in Europe, but their remedy is to have no influence at all. Norway has to pay access to the EU from the EEA, but has no say on the running of the single market. The nationalists say decisions are best if they are taken only by people who live in Scotland. They complain about decisions they don't like being made for the whole of the UK, but want to make sure they never have any say at all about any of them. 2 of the last 3 chancellors have been Scottish MPs. I want future Scottish MPs to be able to be Chancellor or Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And when you read the Nationalist Fiscal Commission is recommending that an independent Scotland should sign a fiscal pact with the rest of the UK that gives the UK Chancellor a veto over Scottish economic plans in perpetuity, you will think it makes even more sense to help choose that person. Each relationship is being placed at risk. The nationalists want out of the UK, and some Conservatives, perhaps even a decisive number within that party, want out of Europe. We see David Cameron flirting with leaving Europe to keep some of his own party off his back. It is one of the reasons why I believe Britain benefits from a coalition that anchors Britain in the centre ground and will not let him take the risk in this Parliament. But the risk is still there, and that is why this is the time when we have to make the case. In Britain, in Europe, in work. It is by being in that we can make the changes happen that can help the future for Scottish jobs and prosperity. And we can do that while still gaining from the great backstop and insurance we get. When Alistair Darling got that phone call from the RBS saying they were just hours from running out of money, He knew he had the strength of the UK as insurance. And Greece relied on the insurance from the European Union. We can be proud Scots who share that great backstop and insurance even as we propose for reform. For reform in the EU, we need to remove the last barriers of trade. We should open up the online industries, the energy market, and services like accountancy, law, and architecture, so that Scottish companies with a competitive edge can expand trade and create jobs. We need to build on the success that changed the European patent system that saved entrepreneurs £20,000 each in protecting their intellectual property and protecting jobs. We should work for an EU that is prepared to think small and exempt small businesses from regulations when appropriate. The benefits to Scottish and British businesses are huge and can be bigger still. A future in Europe in work. For reform in the UK, my party has set out our proposals through the work of our Home Rule and Community Rule Commission. This work was led by Sir Mingus Campbell and was published a little over a year ago. I want to take some time now to explain the conclusions of the Commission, what they recommended, what they did not, and what the economic consequences might be. The Commission started from the principle that for countries to be as successful as they can be, power needs to be shared. It is a long-standing liberal belief that power should be shared. Modern successful countries are more successful if fiscal power is not hoarded in the centre. There is a body of work from the OECD that shows that decentralisation of spending or taxation has real advantages to an economy. And instinctively, as a liberal, I can see the signs in efficiency if authority is decentralised and decisions are made more locally. You may have seen in the news recently that Business Secretary Vince Cable has complained about the London effect, which runs the risk of sucking the life out of the economies in other parts of Britain. He's right to be concerned, even as a London MP, because of the strain such regional imbalances put onto his city and the House Bryce bubble that results. The answer, concluded Ming Campbell, is for power, and in particular economic power, to be put in the hands of nations and regions, so that every part of the UK can have a nimble government equipped with the resources and the clout to act to the benefit of its area. The vision was for responsible government, where each tier has to levy taxes as well as spend the money. Our idea is for a federal structure to the UK, or Home Rule all round, as Gladstone called it. For certain and for sure, the Scottish Parliament would get new responsibilities to raise the majority of the money it spends. Other parts of the UK would be able to acquire those same tax powers if they wanted them, and the substantial legislative authority that already is held by the Scottish Parliament. Accountable, powerful, responsible government with the great backstop and insurance from being part of the UK. The Home Rule Commission agreed that the welfare state was something that was best dealt with on a UK-wide basis. They reached that judgment because they wanted to protect mobility of labour. They wanted to make sure that people could work, look for work, save for retirement, and get their pension anywhere in the UK, without worrying about what they might be entitled to. On the single UK market, the Home Rule Commission was absolutely clear that preserving the single market protects the jobs that depend on it. They took that common sense approach that businesses opening new branches will prefer not to cross a border. Remember that border effect I was talking about earlier. So the Commission recommended allocating all of the substantial levers over income and wealth to the Scottish Parliament. That would give the Parliament real powers to tackle poverty and inequality if it chose, and it gave the resources to make big democratic decisions. Income tax, inheritance tax, capital gains tax and more would be transferred to the Scottish Parliament. More than half of the spending would be paid for by taxes raised in Scotland. It gives the Scottish Parliament control of Scotland's destiny while remaining part of the UK. Some of the big institutions of the UK, such as the HMRC, would be turned into federal bodies that would be required to help and assist the Scottish Parliament and other assemblies. The Commission recommends changes to make the Scottish Parliament a permanent institution and not one that could theoretically be abolished against its will by a future Westminster Parliament. It remains the most comprehensive modern blueprint for a stronger Scotland inside a federal UK. In designing the basket of taxes, the Commission missed a particular economic lever off the list of taxes available to the Scottish Parliament: corporation tax. The Commission assigned the revenues from corporation tax to give the Scottish Parliament a stake in the fruits of economic growth. I want to dwell on the reasons why the revenues were assigned rather than control of the rates allocated to the Scottish Parliament. After all, many people propose giving powers over corporation tax to the Scottish Parliament. And by powers over corporation tax, they usually mean cutting corporation tax. And it often appears to be the only lever they really want to use. The Nationalists in particular have a lot banking on this remedy. So it's worth spending a moment on the argument. The Scottish Government has published plans for a 3% cut in corporation tax. They say it will create 29,000 jobs after the first 20 years. That is what I meant when I referred to the 130,000 jobs for Scotland since 2010 under the coalition. It is probably too cheeky for me to suggest to such an august gathering that the Nationalist plan appears to take 7 times as long to create 1/4 of the jobs we have seen under the Con Dems. So instead, I will set out 2 major flaws to the corporation tax policy. The first, that it is not cost-free. The government that elects to cut corporation tax will suffer an immediate loss of revenue. The Scottish Government say their plan would lose them £396 million in the first year alone. They hope to get it back as the economy grows. A similar idea in Northern Ireland led to its economic group to conclude that it would take 6 years to break even. That is 6 years before the proceeds from the tax would exceed the level before the cut. The Treasury published a thorough study in relation to its recent cuts to UK corporation tax. That report says the Treasury will never get the money back in tax receipts. The financial benefits they identify will go into private hands through better wages and more profits for companies. The difference between 6 years and never is quite important. So this is a big question for the Scottish Government's plans. How much does it cost in total and over how many years? And it's not a question that's getting any answers. I tabled parliamentary questions in the summer asking how long it would take for tax revenues to recover. The answers dodged the issue. So we tabled a freedom of information request to get hold of the detailed modelling so we could work it out for ourselves. The response from the Scottish Government's official was interesting. She refused to give out the information and said, "Releasing the data and assumptions behind the simulations may lead to opposition parties starting a debate." And went on to say that this would not be in the public interest. And we found out last week that the Information Commissioner for Scotland has given permission for the Scottish Government to keep this information to themselves. The Commissioner took that decision because Scottish ministers had told her that policy in this area remained under active development and they had not reached a settled view on it. For those of us in the Scottish Parliament who hear the mantra of certainty on corporation tax every day, it's odd to find out that ministers have not finished working on it yet. So we will wait to see if the Scottish Government has sufficient confidence in its policy to publish the information before polling day. Otherwise, it's a policy gamble that cuts tax revenues and cuts public service jobs, which we may or may not get back from new private businesses, but we don't know because they won't show us the details. The Scottish Parliament Information Centre drew attention to this when they warned in a report back in August that policy costs are not presented in the Scottish Government report. And the published modelling work undertaken for Scotland does not provide evidence to attempt to estimate the payback period. And most devastating of all, it said, the Scottish Government does not account for potential responses from other territories or consider the impact of the policy on other territories. And that is the second fatal flaw. It assumes no reaction from other governments. Let me show you what that means. In the autumn of 2012, the First Minister went on a tour of England to set out his case for independence. It included a stop in Newcastle. He addressed the North East Economic Forum. He told them he wanted to be their friend, but would nonetheless make it his policy to undercut their economy. As he drove home, the Northern Echo news headline said, "The North needs its own Alex Salmond." As he arrived at Bute House, he must have been pretty pleased, but they didn't mean what he thought. They meant they needed a powerful leader to champion their economy to fend off aggressive cross-border attention. The nationalist negative policies to undercut any UK Chancellor of any political hue on corporation tax for the next 20 years, undercutting our neighbours. And they have built that policy on the assumption that there would be no response whatsoever. That won't happen. No UK Chancellor would sit and watch one of their regional economies hit by a neighbour aggressively undercutting them on corporation tax. The very point of that great backstop and insurance from the UK is to protect the different parts of the UK. And then you get a race to the bottom. And suddenly we find that public services everywhere can't be afforded. The losers are people who rely on spending power of government. We don't want to fire the starting pistol in a race to the bottom. That really will be the worst race ever. I don't want destructive and unhelpful competition. I want strong regional power bases to build positive economies on strengths. That is why my party's Home Rule plans would give the North East of England strong regional leadership to meet the challenges on infrastructure, investment and skills to allow businesses to thrive. Ours is a positive sharing of power to allow all parts of the UK to build on their strengths. The long-term future for Scotland and Newcastle is to have businesses that grow by being the best at what they do and making sure everyone knows it and everyone uses them everywhere in Britain, then everywhere in Europe, and then the world. Strength in the long term by being the best, not by being temporarily the cheapest place on one tax. And that is exactly the point I made earlier about the priorities to protect the single market in Europe and in Britain to get and keep us in work. And that, I think, allows me to start my final section, which is to explain where I see Liberal Democrat economic priorities. As a party working across Britain, we have set ourselves the challenge to champion a stronger economy in a fairer society to enable everyone to get on in life. We say that gives us a unique purpose. People know that you can't trust the Conservatives on fairness. Their first instinct will always be to cut taxes for millionaires. Remember, they said in 2010 they couldn't afford to cut taxes for ordinary people. People know that you can't trust Labour for a strong economy because people remember the financial mess they left behind and the unsustainable borrowing that lies behind their plans. I look at the three great challenges facing this generation, and I want action to tackle them. Poverty, an ageing population and climate change. It's about endurance. How can we keep the living standards we have grown used to in this country for the next generations, given the scale of the change we have seen in the world? I have sometimes compared these to the five evils identified by the great liberal William Beveridge in the 1940s. Squalor, ignorance, want, idleness and disease. He set them out in his blueprint for the modern welfare state. The language may have changed, but the scale of the challenge remains. I have 2 or 3 solutions we can implement in Scotland that will coordinate well with the steps already being taken across the UK. The first is participation. If our country is going to be a success in the 21st century and beyond, then it's going to need the talents and efforts of everyone. If you want a fair society, then no one should be left out of the economy or their community. Too many are at the moment. Even with higher employment rates, they can be higher still. Fundamentally, the route to participation is education. It has been the route out of poverty and to a life of achievement for 100 years. But we still don't do enough. I've been struck by the work of Professor James Heckman, who won the Nobel Prize for his analysis. He has shown how investment in a child's education before the age of 3 is the investment that gets the best, biggest return. In terms of that child's development and in the benefits of the wider society from being an engaged and successful part of their community. That investment needs a big shift in where we have been putting the emphasis as a country. But if we are going to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty and remove those stubborn barriers that condemn too many people to the margins, then we have to make a radical change. That's why I've been banging on about childcare for 2 years in the Scottish Parliament. There is no reason why we can't start to make the changes that benefits tens of thousands of children every year. The First Minister has now agreed that we can work together to implement Stage 1 in Scotland from August, and that is going to need considerable effort to make sure that well-trained staff and quality buildings are available and that parents know what they can expect. From August this year, a further 8,400 two-year-olds can expect a free place in education and childcare, and it rises to 15,000 next year. And to help everyone get on later in life, we need places at colleges and apprenticeships for those who want them. Colleges have been hit hard in their budgets in recent years. We need to support colleges. There have been 1 million extra apprentices across the UK since 2010. The Scottish Government has maintained high levels in Scotland, but the report of the UK Commission for Employment and Skills still shows fewer companies in Scotland take on apprentices than elsewhere in Britain. We need to foster a demand for apprentices from first-time companies. Report after report shows record-breaking satisfaction from employers with apprentice training. Half go as far as recommending the value for apprenticeships to other companies. I hope that businesses will use the savings they make in April from the new National Insurance Allowance to invest in apprentice places. We should help everyone get on in life by supporting more women into science, maths and engineering. And science as a whole should be nurtured. The Royal Society of Edinburgh report last year showed the lost talent from women dropping out of science and technology. They calculated that doubling the contribution from women in these specialisms would add £170 million to national income. The steps the UK government has taken to cut income tax for low and middle incomes means that the rewards from starting work are greater, even if you think the starting pay is low. Remember that from April, people's income tax will have been cut by £700 a year since 2010. More than 2 million Scots have benefited, and I can see how we can go further still so that the incentives to take a job just keep on growing. The second remedy is strong industry sectors. We need to make sure we keep a balance in the economy. Scotland has the comparative and technical advantage in big industries like oil and gas, renewable energy, food and drink and life sciences. We have a quality tourism offer. Our financial services sector is big and enjoys succeeding as part of a single UK financial services market. Universities will be hugely important. The Grow, Export, Attract, Support report last year from University Scotland showed up front their contribution of well over £6 billion to the Scottish economy and support for 140,000 jobs. And they report that Scottish universities engage in nearly 30% of the work on innovation with small companies, even though they only form 10% of the UK university base. In Britain, in work at Scottish universities. They are doing exactly the work that needs to be done to help small and medium businesses become excellent and innovative and grow into those single markets that I described at the start of this evening. Investment in new green technology is possible thanks to the Green Investment Bank, servicing the whole UK, but located here in Edinburgh. The UK government is giving real support to manufacturing, supporting R&D with tax credits, tackling the deficit to give confidence to investors. They are making it easier for small business to recruit new staff. We can remove London drag with Home Rule all round. And as the UK government is doing in England, a regional growth fund and city deals to build strength in every part of the country. And I'm supporting Glasgow City Council's campaign for a city deal of its own to give that council more powers to act for their city. As a Scottish Liberal Democrat, I can say that we have brought forward plans to support all of these things across Scotland, in work wherever you are in Britain. And we have always combined it with a desire to make sure that all parts of Scotland can benefit, not just the Central Belt. Part of Ming Campbell's report showed how responsible government can be extended to local authorities, equipping them with tax powers and tools they need to support jobs and the economy in the area. Scotland-wide, at the 2011 election, we showed that we could change Scottish Water to keep it in the public sector, but change its status so that it was owned by its customers rather than just the government. This would free up a vast amount of public money, which we said should go into new regional development banks, each run by a consortium of local authorities, colleges, businesses, and universities. This would be able to tackle skills, infrastructure, and investment in the local economy everywhere in Scotland, from superfast broadband to very fast rail routes to Aberdeen and Inverness. We said that that would have been worth 100,000 jobs. Those come from helping sole traders recruit their first staff, renewable energy growth, superfast broadband, meeting the CBI and the SCDI's proposals to increase exports and regional investment. But as the First Minister never tires of reminding me, we didn't win that election. So could I please stop mentioning it? Now, I can imagine what many of you are thinking. This all sounds great, but is it ever going to happen? Well, I can tell you that change is going to come. Liberal Democrats have been able to shepherd change, even in the absence of an overall majority, since Asquith was the MP for my home village of Strathmiglo. As Joanne Lamont mentioned at this lecture a fortnight ago, Liberal Democrats stood alongside the churches, trade unions and the Labour Party in the Constitutional Convention to bring about our national parliament. The Conservatives said they couldn't afford tax cuts for ordinary people in 2010, but we insisted in the coalition that we did. And the First Minister said he couldn't do childcare for 2-year-olds without independence, but we showed that he could. I ask you to look at what's happening on a more powerful Scottish Parliament. On the Constitution, my party has refreshed our 100-year-old commitment to Home Rule all round and set out details of a Scotland and a Britain where people have a nimble, powerful governments on their side. Our work has shown Labour what is possible, and we have seen the previous hostility of the Conservatives to constitutional reform washed away with their Strathclyde Commission on more powers for the Scottish Parliament. Reform Scotland has published Devo Plus. The IPPR and Alan Trench published Devo More. The Welsh Assembly wants actions on its powers. And the UK government is tackling the London effect by signing city deals with local authorities across England that puts powerful tools for skills, investment and infrastructure into the hands of local communities, including the northeast of England. I imagine to the great delight of the Northern Echo. The consensus for change is growing, and I think we can be certain that, subject to the consent of the voters in 2015 election, decentralising reform across Britain is now building such a momentum that it will happen. To push that further, I have asked Sir Mingus Campbell today to return to the issue. In their first report, the Campbell Commission said, "We invite other parties, organisations and individuals across Scotland to consider our views and engage in principled debate. We are conscious that the constitutional structures of our country should be built on the broadest possible consensus if they are to endure and be sustainable." I want Campbell to examine this emerging consensus. I want to harness the expertise and insight that allowed Sir Mingus Campbell and the Scottish Liberal Democrats to publish our work first. That expertise should now be turned to assessing the growing consensus and planning a timetable for implementing lasting, permanent constitutional change after the referendum. Within a few weeks, I want Campbell to show just how widespread the consensus is and just how quickly it can be turned into actual change. This shows how seriously I take this. I said at the start that each of our trading relationships is being put at risk. I have said how I support a stronger economy and a fairer society. You cannot have one without the other. I have evidently focused on steps for a stronger economy this evening, but my proposals on participation give an idea of where progress on a fairer society will come. I have shown that being in Europe and in Britain means being in work for hundreds of thousands of people. I've drawn parallels between the formation, development and current critics of the two unions. I have said that those relationships are being placed fundamentally at risk. Now is the important time for people to speak up. Tonight has been one such opportunity. I'm grateful to you, Jeremy, and to the David Hume Institute, to the Young Academy of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and the RHC itself, and the supporters of the series of presentations for the chance to make the case. In Europe, in Britain, in work. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Willie, and microphones are now appearing. While they're emerging, can I just ask, just to spell out a little bit more what you were saying at the end about what you've asked Ming Campbell to undertake, a timetable for implementing lasting, permanent constitutional change after the referendum to show how widespread the consensus is and just how quickly it can be turned into actual change. I mean, one of the questions that has been asked throughout this series is what no might mean. Will you be able to tell us what no might mean, or will we just have one view from the Lib Dems and discussions, no doubt, from the Strathclyde Commission, from others? Or are we going to get, in the reasonably near future, any clearer perception of what might happen in the event of a no vote?
I mean, I think anybody who looks at the various reports that have been published, including the interim report from the Labour Party, will see that the principle of raising the majority of the money that we spend is pretty well established. And I think the Devo Plus and the Devo More reports set out that. There may be arguments on the edge about which exact taxes you use, but the principle of raising the majority of the money that you spend is pretty well established. Gordon Brown made a pretty important speech regarding the Constitution a little while back, and he talked about a written Constitution, and at the centre of that, he was expressing the view that the Scottish Parliament should be entrenched, enshrined, so that it can't be undone. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I think we're seeing the Labour Party moving in that direction of the principle that the Scottish Parliament should be a permanent institution. Now, you're always going to get voices off, but I think the central thrust of all the parties is where the majority of Scottish people are, which is in favour of more powers.
So you're in favour of something close to full fiscal devolution?
Well, you get funny into these different terminologies. full fiscal autonomy, fiscal independence, fiscal federalism.
Well,
There's a whole lot of different terms.
The Scotland Act 2012 didn't exactly involve a great deal of devolution on the fiscal side. You want something
We want
much more significant than that.
Yes. I mean, we're saying all of income tax, all the rates,
Okay.
which is the Calman Commission didn't recommend that. It was half the basic rate. So we're doing everything on that. Inheritance tax, capital gains tax, all the taxes on wealth.
Everything except corporation tax, which you talked about
Yeah,
quite
we
fully.
wouldn't do VAT either.
No. Okay, let's turn to the audience. There are lots of questions, so if we start with the lady at the front, and then the gentleman with the yellow jersey, who you probably can't see there. So if we take two questions at a time, given we're late, to be fairly...
Yeah, thanks. Elizabeth Meehan. I would think from what I read of opinion polls that most people in Scotland would agree with your vision of some kind of federal United Kingdom. But therefore, it leaves me the huge puzzle about why it was that your Secretary of State, your party's Secretary of State for Scotland, I think he didn't use the word quick and dirty, I think he used the word quick and decisive. So I can't understand what was quick and decisive or dirty about denying people, as it were, the right to vote for what it was they really wanted to say yes to. And so now I think you've really put a sort of spanner in the works, as it were, by giving people a choice, which is a sort of meaningless one.
Okay, if we just pass the mic back to the other gentleman, we'll take both questions at one time. And if we can take a couple of questions lining up here then as well. Okay.
My name is Hugh Hunter-Gordon. I'm retired, and as I put it the other night, I'm past it. My question is to do with something which you only just touched on. It's to do with oil and gas. It's to do with more negative matters than the very positive approach that you've taken so far. And it's really to do with the Shetlands. The Shetland Islands, in the report which was made by Lord Kilbrandon, 1978, which one of your colleagues, Tavish Scott, has a copy of, and which he reported in 2012 in his various endeavours, suggests that it's more than possible that the Shetland Islands do not belong to Scotland. They belong to the United Kingdom, the post-Union United Kingdom. And that in the event, therefore, of independence, the Shetland Islands, with its oil and gas and all its fisheries and every other associated territorial rights that it might have, would naturally reside with England or the rest of the United Kingdom, or whatever you want to call it, and therefore not with Scotland. Under those circumstances, there must be a substantial impact upon all the forecasts which have been made by the Scottish government, and therefore the likelihood of Scotland, as they perceive it, being surviving and capable.
Thank you.
That's the question.
Let's take those two first.
I think Shetland, has expressed a clear view that they want to remain part of Scotland and part of the United Kingdom. I tend to look for the positives rather than the doomsday scenarios of what would happen under such circumstances. But the right of self-determination is clearly at play with Orkney and Shetland and even the Western Isles, who have come together and formed this new view about more powers after the referendum. And I tend to look down that path as they want more autonomy and more authority in their areas rather than the doomsday scenario of us being independent. But ultimately, it's up to the people who live there to decide what they want to do. The second question, the ballot paper. It would have undermined our ambition of Home Rule because, first of all, technically it would be difficult to do, to have effectively two questions on the one referendum. It would have caused confusion. Well, people are bright enough to work these things out. It would have caused confusion because you'd be two different sets of arguments in the one referendum would have been quite challenging. The referendum in 97 with two questions, both were consistent with each other. But the technical problem you would have had is that even if 99% voted for Devo Max, as they would have called it, even if 99%, if 51% had voted for independence, independence would still win, even though it was the least popular option. Now, that would have been a farce. Now, lots of people came up with all sorts of various ways of trying to make it work, but none of them I could see working. So it would have undermined our ambition, is our belief. So it's unfortunate. because we did consider it seriously, but it was something that we ruled out in the end.
But isn't there a real risk that if there is a no vote, the UK government will be preoccupied with its own general election coming up, preoccupied with what to do about Europe, given what's happened in the European elections and what happens to UKIP, and it will say, OK, Scotland, you've had your chance, go on the back burner, please, and we're not going to talk about any of these issues that the Lib Dems have had. I mean, they tried 100 years ago and it didn't work. Let's just leave it there for the moment. It's not the time to address these issues. Another 20 years from now, maybe.
They know this issue will return and keep returning unless they get a sustainable solution. In advance of the referendum, my job is to nail them down and to make sure we get an absolute commitment that we're going to do more in advance of the referendum. Now is the opportunity to really press the case, but I think it's a sustainable solution, is this federal UK.
So your job is to nail it down before the referendum, that there's a commitment from all the parties to address this seriously and properly, with some growing consensus that you're asking from in Campbell, and to get that embedded well before we get to referendum day.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Well, there are two more. There's a lady there. Let's take the lady first, and the gentleman afterwards. Okay.
Fiona McNeill from the Young Academy of Scotland. I'm interested in your focus on Europe. I absolutely agree that Scotland's position in Europe is crucial. But for me, I think that Scotland in Europe is a little bit in conflict with Scotland in Britain. So I think there's a real possibility that Britain might leave the EU in the near future. But even if we stay in the EU, I think that the hostility of a lot of Britain towards Europe, for example, the resentment of Britain to EU migration, which has caused a lot of waves in Europe, and the fact that so many of our MEPs are UKIP, I think this makes it problematical to form positive relationships with other countries. I think an independent Scotland could form positive, collaborative relationships with countries all over Europe based on mutual respect that would be difficult for a Scotland that's part of a hostile and possibly absent Britain to do.
Okay, and if you pass the mic forward to the gentleman, we'll take this one as well.
Thank you. I don't think I disagree with anything that you've said tonight, Willie, but what I'm slightly concerned about, even though you've talked about bringing forward some sort of consensus prior to the referendum in September, is that while we're in a long campaign, time is beginning to run out. And is there not a clamant need for the parties opposed to independence to really come forward pretty quickly with something that they can go forward with? I'm not underplaying the difficulties that arise from that. The Lib Dems obviously are in favour of a federal solution. The Labour Party have their own ideas. Ruth Davidson in a week's time may have her separate ideas. But the polls are moving, it would appear. And if the opposition parties, the better together supporting parties, do not come forward with what they can agree on soon, the electorate are likely to be left wondering, what on earth does a no vote actually mean?
Three voices may be weaker than one. Okay, to Europe, and then are you going to get this moving?
It would be difficult enough if Scotland and the rest of the UK were to separate in terms of trade and all our other relationships, if both were inside the European Union. You can imagine if one was outside the European Union and the other one was in and we were separate, how much more difficult that trade across the Scottish-English border would be. So Scotland needs the rest of the UK in Europe. It needs it, because we need to be working in tandem. The whole approach from the SNP government is this kind of gradualist move apart. That's why they want to keep all these good things about the UK, the currency and all the rest of it. Just imagine if it was this sudden change where the rest of the UK was to leave Europe and Scotland was to get in eventually into Europe. Just imagine how difficult that relationship would be. So I don't think, sometimes I think the nationalists wish to play up the whole UKIP tendency in England. But they need to be careful what they wish for, because actually we need the whole of the United Kingdom trading bloc to remain together in the European Union, in my view, to maximise the opportunities for us. But you say that Scotland would be a much more participative member of the European Union. The first act of an independent Scotland would be to demand not to be in the euro, to demand to keep the rebate, would be to demand changes, big changes to the common fisheries policy, would be to demand to stay out of Schengen. That's almost exactly the same approach as the UK government. So I'm not so sure that your view of what an independent Scotland relationship with the rest of the European Union would be is right. So we need to be careful what we wish for in that. In terms of, I don't think I disagree with an awful lot of what you're saying. I think, the referendum's coming fast. And, I know the other parties are working hard on their reports. But we need to do it. We need to make sure that these reports come out and that people see that kind of common consensus across all the parties and what we're offering. I think the emerging consensus is there, but we need to get on with it.
Can you do it when you've got 3 parties in Scotland, 3 parties in London, better together? You've got voices all over the place. How do you get the consensus that is actually going to be something that people can latch onto and say, A, I understand what no might mean, and B, I trust that there would be steps in this direction if the referendum says no to independence?
I think
That's a huge ask, isn't it?
I think you underestimate the abilities of Sir Ming Campbell. I think Ming will be able to bring all the people together. But from the talks I've had at a UK level as well as at a Scottish level, there is engagement in this issue. They understand the need to do it. They have the desire to do it. So I don't think it's as difficult as some portray it to be.
Well, I hope you're right. There's a microphone down here for Peter Jones. Is there another question in the House? And one down here as well. Okay.
Thanks. Peter Jones, journalist. Campbell 1 report talks about the need, if the kind of fiscal devolution you've outlined in is to be introduced, well, there'll have to be a needs assessment exercise to assess the needs of the various component parts of the UK in terms of public spending. All the available evidence, such as it is, most of it comes from the Silk Commission in Wales, suggests that Scotland currently gets rather more in public spending terms from the Treasury than it actually needs or would be justified by a needs question, which might make the prospect of public spending cuts and therefore your devolution, further fiscal devolution, rather unattractive in Scotland. How do you propose to deal with that?
Dave Gorman, day job is Edinburgh University. Quick comment if I can, which is just to agree about corporation tax, but to add another round, which is, if you like, with loads of companies sitting with loads of money on the balance sheet and with wages as a percentage of national income at historic low levels, to offer another cut would be strange. But my question is more around your views about the currency, because it seems to me of all the issues that are going to play out in the debate, the issues around currency are particularly interesting, and the SNP's view of the world is particularly interesting, this kind of claim for freedom but yet constraint. So I'm interested in just your views about the currency issue. Thank you.
Peter, I'm sure you've seen in the report that this is about a gradual change over to the needs-based formula. What we are arguing, and we've not determined how quickly you would move on this, but it would be Barnett minus the taxes that we raise rather than needs assessment plus. And Danny Alexander has been pretty clear that the Barnett formula is not going to change anytime soon. So it's one of these things that will gradually come over time when the time is right, but we need to make sure we embed the constitutional change before we make any radical changes like the abandonment of the Barnett formula, in my view. But we don't say we're going to do it tomorrow. We've never said that we would do that. In terms of the currency, I find it quite interesting that the nationalists paint the rest of the United Kingdom as this kind of malevolent force, not interested in Scotland, but will suddenly turn into a benevolent country as soon as we separate from them, and will agree to keep all the good things and share all the good things with Scotland and its neighbour. Now, I'm sure the rest of the United Kingdom will be reasonable, but they're not going to agree to every single demand from an independent Scotland if it's not in their interest to do so. And it's been quite clear, if the Scottish Government wants to create a different economic policy to do something quite radically different from Scotland over time, that will create tensions on that. The fiscal pact will have limitations, at least in the initial stages, but the tensions over time would cause problems. So I can see the United Kingdom seeing it's not in their interest, and that's why George Osborne has said that it's highly unlikely that it would happen.
In this very hall the day that Governor Carney made his speech, I heard John Kay, who was on the platform here with Gavin Macron, who's here, and others. And I think I quote John Kay correctly, and apologies if I don't. I think what he said was any agreement that would be offered by the UK government with Bank of England advice on a currency union would be one that so constrained freedoms for Scotland that any self-respecting nationalist would have to reject it. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, it's exactly the point. The point I was making in my contribution was that we would want to remove any influence over who the Chancellor of the Exchequer would be. But we would be in a fiscal pact with them. So they would have the final say, but we would have no influence in electing them. So that's exactly the point.
Might go somewhat beyond a fiscal pact. Do we have a couple more questions? There's one here, and there's a gentleman at the back. I think we probably ought to wrap up after that, if that's all right with you. Yes.
Thomas Ward. If we assume a successful outcome to the Better Together campaign immediately following the result of the referendum, do you think there's any prospect of us managing to persuade a politician of the calibre, for example, of Alistair Darling, to become a member of the Scottish Parliament and then to lead a coalition of parties who will be positively driving for a new relationship between Scotland and the British government?
Interesting. Gentlemen.
Bruce Beveridge, President of the Law Society of Scotland. About 3 weeks ago now, Ipsos Mori released some polling, which we'd asked them to do. And this is a question I've asked a couple of folk. 3 stats from that. It was about how well-informed people feel about the referendum. 14% of people thought they felt well-informed, dropping to 10% for women. About 50%, just under, felt that the issues they were interested in had been or were being addressed. And about 2/3 felt they didn't know whether or not to believe the information that they were being given. The referendum will happen in about 3 weeks on Thursday, it's how it feels now. What would you do differently in the next few months to try and make sure that the vast amount of information that is out there, because make no mistake, there's a vast amount of information out there, A, gets through to the broadest sense of the electorate, and not just the folk who are engaged in the quite esoteric debates. Things like currency we've been talking about are very, very important, but not to a huge proportion of the population. What would you do to reach more people and make more people feel very well informed? Because
yeah. Okay, we're squeezing in one last short question.
My question, in fact, perhaps follows on to that, Willie, and that is, do you have a view, and it's perhaps an unfortunate reflection on distrust of politicians, as to whether Tom Hunter's supposedly factual website will help people make a proper decision?
I mean, I've been around elections for quite some time now, and I'm always puzzled sometimes how you get ebbs and flows of public opinion. And I'm maybe not surprised when they say, do you have enough? People say no, because people are never going to say, yes, we've got enough. We're flooding people with information. There is lots out there. It's making sense of it is the challenge. Having somebody who is able to capture it, and it's not me. I don't think it's necessarily any politician who does this. It's other people who come into the debate and participate, and perhaps who's going to bring it and make sense to people in their communities. So I think that's where it will come. Now, how that's going to happen, I don't know. I don't know whether it's Better Together it does it, or Yes campaign or not. But the great thing about this referendum, and I wasn't in favour of it initially, but the great thing about it is I think at the end of this process, no matter what the outcome, people in Scotland will know quite a bit more about how their country works and ticks than when we started. And I think that's a good thing. that people will know. They'll know more about how oil and gas works. They'll know more about how the whisky industry contributes to the economy. They'll know more about super-fast broadband and how important it is Europe, our relationship with the EU. They'll understand all those things much better than at the start of the process. So I don't get too worried about these opinion polls, but the basic distrust in politicians is something that endures. I was at Lochgelly High School yesterday to do a 4th, 5th and 6th years debate. And one of the pupils asked this brilliant question. He said, why should we believe a word that anybody on the panel says? Brilliant question. And how do you answer that question? Exactly. So, I mean, but it was a very pertinent question because of that distrust, that breakdown in trust. And I think, therefore, it's incumbent upon everybody. Everybody's got a responsibility in this. They shouldn't wait to be spoon-fed. They need to, this is their country. They need to go and read about stuff themselves as well. They can't expect everybody just to put it on a plate for them. There's information out there. They need to go and find that. And that's what I said to him yesterday. He needs to go and research it, find it for himself. Alistair Darling, I would love him to come to the Scottish Parliament. People of that calibre would be great in the Scottish Parliament. There are some very good people in the Parliament already, but I think the more we have, the better it will be. And I think that probably answers all the questions.
Well, I think the question of how we actually get the information across, you have, is perhaps as difficult a question as any. Now, I'm very grateful to you for coming and quite understand why you had to vote, and we'll find out what the result is in due course. In abbreviating the introduction, which I didn't mention, is what your office tells me is your view of your finest achievement in life, which is being the runner-up in the Scottish Coal Carrying Championship. Now, all I would suggest is that achieving a consensus across all the interested parties in good time to inform the referendum debate as to what the option might be, what a realistic option might be, with a good prospect of being implemented in a sensible timescale. If you achieve that, I think you will not remember being runner-up in a competition, but remember being champion of a very difficult competition. So I wish you all the best in that, and we will watch with interest the Campbell 2 within the next few weeks, and time is tight. We will no doubt ask Ruth Davidson next week how she is responding to this process, and we will no doubt keep in touch with this as it develops. But thank you very much for coming along. I must again thank the Young Academy and our supporters from 4 professional bodies, but I'd like now all of those here to thank Willie Rennie for his very stimulating address. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to the